Imagine moving into your dream home, a serene lake house meant to be your sanctuary, only to be met by a clipboard-wielding tyrant determined to make your life a living nightmare. This is the story of Jackson Reeves, a man whose fresh start in Teton antiquity, a pristine lakeside community turned into a clash with the most formidable HOA president imaginable. What unfolds is a tale of power, pettiness, and a secret that will turn an entire neighborhood upside down. The moving truck hadn't even finished backing into my driveway when I saw her marching across the street like she was leading an invasion force. Designer tennis outfit at 8:30 a.m. on a Tuesday, clipboard clutched like a weapon, and that particular stride that screams, "I'm about to ruin someone's day." In exactly 47 seconds, this woman would call 911 on me for trespassing in my own house. In 3 hours, she'd discover I owned not just this house, but every property on Waterfront Boulevard, including hers. My name is Jackson Reeves, and I just made the biggest real estate move of my life, though nobody in this pristine lakeside community knew it yet. 6 months ago, I was just another tech executive burned out from 15 years of startup culture. My wife, Sarah, had died 2 years earlier from a sudden brain aneurysm at 34, leaving me with more life insurance money than I knew what to do with, and a desperate need to escape the Silicon Valley pressure cooker that had consumed our entire marriage. The lake house was supposed to be my fresh start, my place to figure out what came next. What I hadn't expected was to walk into a war zone disguised as an upscale neighborhood. The woman approaching my driveway moved with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no in her entire life. Platinum blonde hair styled in what I can only describe as aggressive perfection, makeup that probably cost more than most people's car payments, and an expression that suggested she'd already decided I was guilty of something. The movers. Two guys who'd probably seen every kind of neighbor drama imaginable exchanged knowing looks and suddenly found reasons to be very busy inside the truck. "Excuse me," she called out, before she'd even reached my property line, her voice carrying that special frequency that makes dogs bark and babies cry. "You cannot park that truck here. This is a violation of community standards, and I need to see your authorization papers immediately." Authorization papers for moving into my own house. I set down the box labeled Sarah's Books that I'd been carrying and turned to face what was clearly about to be my introduction to the infamous HOA president I'd heard whispers about from the real estate agent. She'd been vague about the details, just mentioning that the neighborhood had very active community leadership, which I now realized was realtor code for "there's a nightmare human being who thinks she owns everyone's life." "Good morning," I said, trying to keep things civil because I really did want to start fresh here without drama. "I'm Jackson Reeves. I just closed on this house yesterday. The truck will be gone in a few hours once we finish unloading." She looked at me like I just claimed to be the Emperor of Neptune. "That's impossible. This house belongs to the Garrison estate, and they would never sell to someone like—" She paused, her eyes scanning me from my worn jeans to my faded MIT t-shirt, clearly categorizing me as beneath the neighborhood standards. Someone without proper vetting by the Homeowners Association. "I am Bethany Cromwell, HOA president for the last 11 years. And I can assure you that no sale of this property has been approved." The Garrison estate. That was rich. Old man Garrison had died 8 months ago with no heirs, and his property had gone through probate before hitting the market. But apparently, Bethany Cromwell hadn't gotten the memo. Or more likely, she was so used to controlling everything that happened in this neighborhood that the idea of a sale occurring without her blessing was simply incomprehensible. "I have all my paperwork right here," I said, pulling out my phone to show her the closing documents. "Closed yesterday afternoon at 4:00 p.m. with Lakeside Title Company. Would you like to see the deed? She actually recoiled from my phone like it might contaminate her. I don't need to see fraudulent documents. I know for a fact that any sale of property in waterfront estates requires HOA approval, which you clearly don't have. This is obviously some kind of scam. And I'm calling the authorities right now. The movers had stopped pretending to work and were now openly watching the show. One of them, a guy with a Detroit Strong tattooed on his forearm, caught my eye and mouthed, "Good luck," with the kind of sympathy reserved for people about to undergo root canals without anesthesia. "Ma'am," I tried again, "I legally purchased this house. I have the deed, the mortgage documents, everything. I'm not sure what the confusion is, but—" "The confusion?" she interrupted, her voice rising to a pitch that could probably shatter wine glasses. "Is that you're trespassing on private property in a gated community where you clearly don't belong? I'm calling 911 right now, and you better hope they're lenient with whatever fraud charges you're about to face." She pulled out a phone that probably costs more than some people's monthly rent and dramatically dialed, making sure I could see every number she pressed. The theatrical performance was clearly meant to intimidate me into leaving, but what Bethany Cromwell didn't know was that I'd spent the last 6 months doing something much more interesting than just buying a single lake house. If you've ever dealt with someone who thinks their tiny bit of power makes them a dictator, you know exactly where this is heading. Hit that subscribe button right now on HOA Tragedies, because what Bethany doesn't know about who I really am is about to flip this entire neighborhood upside down. And trust me, her face when she finds out is worth every second of what's coming. While Bethany was giving what sounded like a Broadway performance to the 911 dispatcher, complete with claims that I was possibly armed and definitely dangerous, I noticed something interesting. 3 other neighbors had come out of their houses to watch the spectacle, but none of them looked surprised. They looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from dealing with the same exhausting person for years, without any hope of escape. An elderly man across the street caught my eye and gave me a small shrug that seemed to say, "Welcome to the neighborhood. This is what we deal with." A younger woman, 2 houses down, was recording everything on her phone, probably for the inevitable next-door post about the morning's drama, and a middle-aged guy washing his boat in the driveway next door had stopped everything to watch with the expression of someone who'd seen this movie before and knew exactly how it would end. "Yes, officer. He's refusing to leave," Bethany was saying loud enough for the entire street to hear. "He claims to own the Garrison house, which is absolutely impossible. He has a suspicious truck and several accomplices. I think this might be an organized burglary ring." Accomplices, she meant the licensed and bonded moving company, whose logo was literally painted on the side of the truck in letters large enough to see from space. But in Bethy's world, anyone she didn't personally approve of was automatically criminal. The police arrived in about 12 minutes, which was pretty impressive response time for what was essentially a false report about a homeowner existing in his own driveway. Officer Raymond Hutchinson stepped out of the patrol car with the weary expression of someone who'd been called to Bethany Cromwell's complaints before. Many times before, judging by the way his shoulders sagged when he saw her waving frantically from my lawn. "Mrs. Cromwell," he said, with the kind of professional patience that deserved a medal, "what seems to be the issue today?" "This man," she pointed at me like she was identifying a perpetrator in a lineup, "is trespassing and claiming to own the Garrison property. He has no HOA approval, no documentation that I verified, and he's clearly running some kind of elaborate fraud scheme. I need him arrested and removed immediately." Officer Hutchinson looked at me, then at the moving truck, then at the boxes, clearly labeled with normal household items like kitchen and bedroom, then back at Bethany with an expression that suggested he was calculating how many years until retirement. "Sir, can I see some identification and any documentation you have regarding this property?" I handed over my driver's license and pulled up the closing documents on my phone. Including the deed that had been officially recorded with the county that morning, Officer Hutchinson reviewed everything carefully, while Bethany provided a running commentary about how documents could be forged and how criminals were getting more sophisticated these days, and how the safety of the entire neighborhood was at stake. "Mr. Reeves," the officer said after a few minutes, "everything appears to be in order. This is your house. You're free to continue moving in." The look on Bethy's face was like watching someone's entire worldview shatter in real time. Her mouth opened and closed several times without sound, like a fish that had suddenly found itself on dry land. That's impossible," she finally managed. "I would have been notified. The HOA has to approve all sales. This is clearly some oversight that needs to be investigated." "Ma'am," Officer Hutchinson said with barely concealed exhaustion, "Mr. Reeves legally owns this property. He has every right to be here. Making false reports to 911 is a crime, and if you continue to harass him, you could face charges." But Bethany Cromwell wasn't the kind of person who accepted defeat, especially not in front of the neighbors she'd been lording over for more than a decade. She pulled herself up to her full height, which was still several inches shorter than me, even in her designer heels, and delivered what she clearly thought was a killing blow. "Fine, but as HOA president, I'm putting you on notice, Mr. Reeves. You may have somehow acquired this property without proper channels, but you will follow every single rule and regulation to the letter. I'll be watching every move you make, and the first violation will result in immediate fines and legal action. The Garrison House has been empty for 8 months, and I'm sure there are numerous code violations that need immediate attention. I'll be conducting a full inspection this afternoon." She spun on her heel and marched back across the street to her house, a massive Mediterranean-style mansion that looked like it had been designed by someone who thought subtlety was a type of food poisoning. Officer Hutchinson watched her go with the expression of a man who'd rather be anywhere else on the planet. "Word of advice," he said quietly enough that only I could hear. "Document everything. She's filed complaints against every new resident for the past 5 years. The department has a whole file just for her calls. Good luck and welcome to the neighborhood." I guess, as his patrol car pulled away, I noticed something interesting. Several of the watching neighbors were giving me subtle thumbs up or small nods of approval. Apparently standing up to Bethany Cromwell, even unsuccessfully, was enough to earn some respect around here. The guy washing his boat actually walked over, extending a wet hand that he quickly wiped on his shorts before offering it again. "Pete Morrison," he said with a grin. "That was the fastest I've ever seen her call the cops on someone. Usually takes at least a day. You must have really triggered her." "Jackson Reeves, and I honestly have no idea what I did besides exist," Pete laughed. The kind of laugh that held years of accumulated frustration. "That's enough with Bethany. She's convinced she owns this entire neighborhood. Has been ever since her husband made his money in medical devices, and they bought the biggest house on the street. Fair warning, she's not kidding about the inspections. She once fined the Johnsons $3,000 for having their grass half an inch too long. $3,000 for grass. I was beginning to understand why the previous owner's estate had been so eager to sell quickly and quietly. "How is that even legal?" I asked. "It's not usually, but her brother-in-law is a judge, and her cousin runs the biggest law firm in town. Most people just pay the fines rather than fight it. It's easier than dealing with the legal harassment." I looked across the street at Bethy's mansion, then at the other houses along Waterfront Boulevard. What Pete didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd spent the last 6 months quietly purchasing properties through a series of shell companies and private deals. The Garrison House was just the last piece of a much larger puzzle. "Pete, can I ask you something? How many people here actually like living under Bethy's rule?" He snorted. "Are you kidding? Nobody can stand her. But she controls the HOA board through a combination of intimidation and strategic alliances with a few other busybodies who enjoy the power trip. We've tried voting her out 3 times, but she always finds a way to invalidate the results or scare off anyone who runs against her. Interesting, I said, and I meant it. Because what Pete and the others didn't know was that in approximately 3 hours, Bethany Cromwell was going to learn that her reign of terror had a rather significant problem. She'd been collecting HOA fees and issuing fines for properties she had no authority over, properties that, as of yesterday's closing, all had the same owner. Me. The movers had continued working during the police drama, and by noon, most of my furniture was in place. I'd chosen the Garrison House as my personal residence because of its history and character. Built in 1923 by a lumber baron who'd made his fortune clear-cutting forests before anyone cared about environmental protection, it had good bones despite being empty for months. The previous owner, Herbert Garrison, had been a recluse who'd allegedly won the house in a poker game in the 70s and then spent 40 years slowly becoming the neighborhood mystery man. I was in the kitchen unpacking boxes when I heard the doorbell ring with the aggressive persistence of someone who believed their time was more valuable than everyone else's. Through the window, I could see Bethany standing on my porch with what looked like an entire filing cabinet's worth of paperwork and a small army of what I assumed were other HOA board members. 3 women and 1 man, all dressed like they were attending a country club luncheon rather than harassing a new neighbor. Opening the door, I was immediately hit with the combined scent of at least 4 different expensive perfumes mixing into something that probably violated several chemical weapons treaties. "Mr. Reeves," Bethany said with the fake sweetness of arsenic-laced candy, "I'm here for the mandatory HOA inspection of your property. These are board members Patricia Lansing, Dorothy Chen, Margaret Blackwood, and our treasurer, Harold Worthington." Each of them nodded as their name was mentioned. Though Harold looked like he'd rather be getting a colonoscopy than standing on my porch, he had the defeated expression of a man who'd given up fighting his wife's battles years ago. I wasn't aware there was such a thing as a mandatory inspection. I said pleasantly, "Perhaps you could show me the specific bylaw that authorizes this." Bethy's eye twitched slightly, but she recovered quickly, pulling out a document that looked like it had been printed 5 minutes ago. Section 47, subsection 3, paragraph A, clearly states that the HOA board has the right to inspect any property within 30 days of a change in ownership to ensure compliance with community standards. I took the paper and made a show of reading it carefully. The thing about hastily created fake bylaws is that they usually don't hold up to actual scrutiny. This one was particularly amusing because it referenced several state statutes that I happened to know had been repealed 3 years ago. "This is fascinating," I said, "but I noticed this document isn't notarized, doesn't have the required state filing number, and references legal codes that no longer exist. Do you have the actual legally filed HOA bylaws, the ones registered with the state?" Patricia Lansing, a woman who looked like she subsisted entirely on cottage cheese and judgment, piped up, "Bethany maintains all official documents. If she says this is valid, then it's valid. That's not really how legal documents work." I replied, "But let me save us all some time. You're not entering my house without a court order. If you have specific concerns about property maintenance, you can submit them in writing through proper legal channels." Bethy's face was turning an interesting shade of red that clashed terribly with her coral lipstick. "You can't refuse an HOA inspection. I'll fine you $500 per day until you comply." "You're welcome to try," I said calmly. "I'll be happy to see you in court, where you can explain to a judge how you're enforcing bylaws that don't legally exist on a property you don't have jurisdiction over." "Don't have jurisdiction?" she practically shrieked. "I am the HOA president. I have jurisdiction over every single property in waterfront estates." And that's when I decided to drop the first small hint of what was coming. "Actually, Bethany, you might want to check the original neighborhood covenants from 1923. They're quite specific about which properties fall under HOA authority. The Garrison House, for instance, predates the HOA formation by 30 years. It was never actually part of the association. The silence that followed was beautiful. You could actually see the wheels turning in her head as she tried to process this information. Harold, I noticed, was trying very hard not to smile. That's ridiculous," she sputtered. "We've been collecting HOA fees from this property for years." "Have you?" I asked innocently. "That's interesting because I've reviewed the records and Herbert Garrison never paid a single HOA fee in 43 years of living here. In fact, he had a rather extensive correspondence with your predecessor about the HOA's lack of authority over his property. Would you like me to share those letters? They're quite entertaining." Dorothy Chen, who had been silent until now, suddenly looked very nervous. "Bethany, maybe we should research this before." "We're not backing down," Bethany snapped at her. "This is clearly some kind of technicality he's trying to exploit. Every house in this neighborhood is part of the HOA. That's how it's always been." "Actually," I said, enjoying this perhaps a bit too much, "that's not how it's always been. But don't worry. You'll have plenty of time to research the actual history. Now, unless you have that court order, I'm going to need you to leave my property." Bethany looked like she was about to have an aneurysm right there on my porch. Her perfectly manicured nails were digging into her clipboard so hard I thought she might snap it in half. "This isn't over. Mr. Reeves, you've just made a very powerful enemy. I will make your life in this neighborhood absolutely miserable. You'll be begging to sell within a month." "I doubt that," I said. "But you're welcome to try. Have a nice day." I closed the door on their shocked faces and went back to unpacking, though I could hear them arguing on my porch for another 10 minutes before they finally left. Through the window, I watched Bethany storm back to her house, her little army trailing behind her like ducklings who just realized their mother might be leading them off a cliff. Now, here's what's really interesting. If you were in my position, knowing something huge that your nightmare neighbor doesn't know yet, would you reveal it right away or let them dig their own grave first? Drop a comment with your answer on HOA Tragedies, because what happens next depends on Bethany making one more massive mistake. And she's about to make it in spectacular fashion. The rest of the afternoon was relatively peaceful, if you don't count the obvious surveillance from Bethy's house. I could see her curtains twitching every few minutes, and at one point, she actually set up a camera on a tripod pointed directly at my front door. The woman had the subtlety of a nuclear explosion around 4 p.m. Pete Morrison wandered over with a six-pack of beer and what he called a neighborhood survival kit, which turned out to be a folder full of documents about Bethy's various crimes against humanity over the years. "Figured you might want to know what you're dealing with," he said, settling into one of the deck chairs on my back porch that overlooked the lake. "This is just the stuff we could prove. There's probably 10 times more that people were too scared to document." The folder was a masterpiece of suburban horror. Finds for everything from unauthorized happiness. Someone had Christmas decorations up one day past Bethy's arbitrary deadline, to excessive child enjoyment, kids playing in their own backyard after 5 Wakati's P. There were photos of her measuring grass with a ruler, testimonials from families who'd moved away rather than deal with her, and even a few police reports from when things had gotten particularly ugly. "And this one's my favorite," Pete said, pulling out a photo of Bethany with a tape measure, checking the distance between someone's mailbox and the curb. She fined the Washingtons $800 because their mailbox was 2 inches too close to the street. 2 inches! How has nobody sued her into oblivion? Some have tried, but she's got deep pockets and that judge brother-in-law I mentioned. Plus, she's smart about it. Never quite crosses the line into something criminally prosecutable. Just stays in that horrible gray area of technically maybe legal if you squint and have a really expensive lawyer. I was about to respond when my phone buzzed with an email that made me smile. It was from my attorney confirming that all the property transfers had been officially recorded with the county as of 5 P. M. Today, every single rental property, vacation home, and investment property along Waterfront Boulevard now had the same owner. Seabreeze Holdings, LLC, a company that I happen to own 100% of. Pete, can I ask you something? How much do you pay in HOA fees? $400 a month? Which is insane, but it's supposedly for neighborhood maintenance and the private beach access. And what maintenance actually gets done? He laughed bitterly. Are you kidding? The roads are cracked, the beach is a mess, and the only thing that gets maintained is Bethy's ego. We've been asking for financial transparency for years, but she always claims the records are being audited or some other excuse. Interesting. And how many rental properties are there in the neighborhood? Pete thought for a moment. Maybe 7 or 8. Why? Just curious about the neighborhood dynamics, I said, which wasn't entirely a lie. I was very curious about how the neighborhood was going to react when they found out their HOA president had been collecting fees from properties she had no authority over, including the 7 rental properties that I now owned, along with the 3 vacation homes that sat empty most of the year, and the 2 properties that had been tied up in estate disputes until I'd quietly resolved them with cash offers the families couldn't refuse. That evening, I was enjoying a peaceful dinner on my deck, watching the sun set over the lake, when I heard a commotion from the street. Through the trees, I could see Bethany holding what appeared to be an emergency HOA meeting in her driveway, complete with a portable microphone and speaker system that definitely violated several noise ordinances. "Attention residents of Waterfront Estates," her voice crackled through the speaker with all the charm of nails on a chalkboard. "Due to the unprecedented security threat posed by our new neighbor, I'm implementing enhanced community safety measures effective immediately. Security threat." I was eating salmon and reading a book about the history of lake development in Michigan. Clearly, I was a menace to society. She continued with a list of new rules that seemed specifically designed to make my life difficult. All moving trucks now required 48-hour advance notice and a $500 deposit. Any modifications to properties required approval from a new architectural committee that she would personally chair, and my personal favorite, Andado Traunfeier Tidurfori. All new residents were required to submit to a background check and provide 3 character references from current HOA members. The assembled neighbors, maybe 15 people out of the 60 houses in the neighborhood, looked more confused than concerned. One brave soul actually raised his hand. "Bethany, these rules seem excessive and possibly illegal. You can't retroactively apply requirements to someone who's already moved in." She turned on him like a shark smelling blood. "Richard, need I remind you about your deck that's 6 inches wider than originally approved? I've been lenient, but that could change." Richard immediately shut up, but I could see others exchanging glances. The fear was palpable, but so was the growing resentment. Bethany had ruled through intimidation for so long that she couldn't see the foundation cracking beneath her feet. The next morning brought a new level of harassment that I had to admit was almost impressive in its pettiness. I woke up at 6 a.m. to find a fluorescent orange violation notice taped to my front door. The crime, my garbage cans were visible from the street. They were in my driveway behind my car, and you could only see them if you stood at a specific angle and really looked for them. But apparently that was enough for a $200 fine. An hour later, another notice, this time for unauthorized vegetation. The previous owner's rose bushes were apparently not on the approved plant list, which I suspected had been created sometime around midnight last night. By noon, I had 6 violations totaling $1,800 in fines, including my personal favorite, excessive quietness indicating possible suspicious activity. She was literally fining me for not making enough noise. But Bethy's campaign of terror hit a snag when she tried to rally more neighbors to her cause. I watched from my window as she went door to door with a petition demanding my immediate removal from the neighborhood. Most people weren't home, or at least pretended not to be. The few who answered their doors looked uncomfortable and made excuses about needing to check with their spouses or think about it. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who lived 3 houses down, actually laughed in Bethy's face. I couldn't hear the conversation, but the body language was clear. Mrs. Patterson was having none of it. And when Bethany tried to push past her into the house, the old lady threatened her with what looked like a rolling pin. That afternoon, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood, partly to get familiar with my new home, but mostly to assess the situation. Waterfront Boulevard was actually a beautiful street when you looked past Bethy's reign of terror. 20 houses on each side, all facing the lake, with a private beach at the end that was supposedly maintained by the HOA, but looked like it hadn't seen maintenance since the Reagan administration. Several neighbors were out in their yards, and most gave me friendly waves or nods. A few even stopped to introduce themselves and apologized for Bethy's behavior. "She wasn't always this bad," said Janet Holmes, who lived 2 doors down from Bethany. "When she first became HOA president, she actually did some good things. But power corrupts, and in Bethy's case, it corrupted absolutely. What changed? Her husband's company went public about 5 years ago. Suddenly, they had more money than God. And she decided that meant she was better than everyone else. Started treating the HOA like her personal kingdom. The worst part is, she's got just enough people scared or bought off that we can't vote her out." I filed that information away and continued my walk, making mental notes about each property. The vacation homes were obvious, shuttered and quiet, with that particular emptiness that comes from being unlived in. The rental properties were harder to spot, but there were tells. Generic furniture visible through windows, multiple cars in driveways, the slight shabbiness that comes from tenants who don't have skin in the game. What struck me most was the potential. This could be an amazing community if it wasn't being strangled by one person's ego. The lake was beautiful, the houses were well built, and most of the people seemed decent. They just needed someone to stand up to the tyrant, and apparently I'd volunteered for the job without meaning to. That evening, I was reviewing property documents when I noticed something interesting. Bethy's house, the massive Mediterranean monstrosity, wasn't actually in her name. It was owned by a trust, the Cromwell Family Trust, which was administered by a law firm in Detroit, a law firm that, as it happened, I'd had dealings with during my property acquisitions. I made a phone call to my attorney, David Sterling, who'd handled the complex web of purchases over the last 6 months. "David, I need you to check something for me. The Cromwell Family Trust, who are the beneficiaries?" "Give me a minute," he said, and I could hear him typing. "Okay, this is interesting. The trust was set up by Harold Cromwell, Sr., Bethy's father-in-law. Bethany and her husband are beneficiaries, but they're not the only ones. There are 3 other children who have equal shares. And who controls the trust? Hold on, this can't be right. The trustee is listed as Seabreeze Holdings, LLC. That must be an error in the recording." I smiled. "It's not an error. When did that change happen?" More typing. "Yesterday at 4:47 p.m., right before the county recorder office closed." "Thanks, David. I'll explain everything tomorrow." I hung up and leaned back in my chair, looking out at the lake. Bethany Cromwell was about to learn that her house, the symbol of her power and superiority, wasn't quite as secure as she thought. The trust that owned it had been in financial trouble for months, hemorrhaging money from bad investments and Harold Sr.'s medical bills before he died. The other beneficiaries had been looking for a way out, and I'd offered them one they couldn't refuse. The next morning, I woke up to find my entire front yard had been decorated with more orange violation notices. They were stuck to everything: my car, my mailbox, every tree, even the garden gnomes that had come with the house. It looked like a demented art installation. But more interesting was the crowd gathered in Bethy's driveway. She'd called another emergency meeting, and this time she'd managed to guilt or threaten more people into attending. Maybe 30 neighbors were standing around looking uncomfortable while she ranted into her portable microphone. "This man is a clear and present danger to our way of life," she was saying as I walked outside to get my mail, making sure to wave at everyone. "He's already shown complete disregard for our rules and traditions. I've discovered he's some kind of tech millionaire who probably made his money doing God knows what kind of shady dealings. Actually, I'd made my money building a cybersecurity company that protected hospitals from ransomware attacks. But why let facts get in the way of a good rant? I propose we take immediate action," she continued. "A special assessment of $5,000 per household to create a legal fund to force him out. We cannot allow outsiders to destroy what we've built here." $5,000. The woman had lost her mind. I could see the shock on people's faces. Most families in the neighborhood were comfortable, but not wealthy. $5,000 was a serious amount of money to throw at harassing a neighbor who'd done nothing but exist. Richard, the guy with the slightly too wide deck, actually found his courage. "Bethany, that's insane. We can't charge people $5,000 just because you don't like the new neighbor. He hasn't actually done anything wrong." "Hasn't done anything wrong?" she shrieked. "He's refused HOA inspection. He's accumulated over $3,000 in fines in 2 days. He's probably planning to turn this into some kind of tech bro party house." I decided this was a good time to make my presence known. I walked over to the gathering holding the stack of orange violations I'd collected from my yard. "Good morning, everyone," I said pleasantly. "Bethany, I wanted to return these to you. Littering is actually a crime in Michigan, punishable by up to 90 days in jail. I've documented everything and filed a report with the sheriff's department." Her face went through several colors before settling on a shade of purple that couldn't be healthy for someone her age. "Those are official HOA notices. No, they're harassment. None of them are legally valid since, as we discussed yesterday, this property isn't under HOA jurisdiction. But please continue your meeting. I'm particularly interested in the part where you're trying to extort $5,000 from each household for a personal vendetta. It's not extortion. It's a special assessment for neighborhood protection." "Protection from what? Me reading books and eating dinner? I notice you haven't mentioned to everyone that you've been collecting HOA fees from properties that aren't part of the association." That sounds like fraud to me. The crowd was getting restless now, and I could see people starting to ask questions. Harold Worthington, the defeated-looking treasurer, suddenly seemed to find his spine. "Actually, Bethany, he raises a good point. We should review which properties are actually part of the HOA before we collect any more fees or assessments." She turned on him like a rabid dog. "Harold, don't you dare undermine me in front of everyone. We've discussed this. Every property in waterfront estates is part of the HOA. But if he's right about the Garrison house," someone started to say. "He's not right about anything," Bethany screamed, completely losing her composure. "This man is trying to destroy our community. Can't you see that?" I pulled out my phone and pretended to check something. "Oh, this is interesting. I just got an email from my attorney, apparently. There are actually 15 properties in waterfront estates that were never legally part of the HOA. 15 properties that have been paying fees for years without any legal obligation to do so. That's roughly $72,000 a year in unauthorized collections. Over 11 years, that's nearly $800,000. I wonder where all that money went." The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone was staring at Bethany, who looked like she'd been hit by a truck. Harold's face had gone pale, and he was frantically pulling out his phone, probably to check the HOA financial records. "You're lying," Bethany said, but her voice had lost its conviction. "You're just trying to cause trouble." "The county property records are public information," I said. "Anyone can verify what I'm saying. In fact, I encourage everyone here to do exactly that. Check when your property was built, when the HOA was formed, and whether your deed actually includes HOA membership. You might be surprised by what you find." People were already pulling out their phones. and I could see the panic in Bethy's eyes. Her carefully constructed kingdom was starting to crumble, and she knew it. "This meeting is adjourned," she said quickly. Grabbing her microphone and speaker, "I need to consult with our legal counsel about these baseless accusations." But people weren't dispersing. They were gathering in small groups, comparing notes, asking questions. I heard someone say they'd never actually seen the HOA charter. Another person mentioned that they'd been trying to get financial records for years without success. Pete Morrison walked over to me with a grin. "That was beautiful. I haven't seen her that flustered in years." "This is just the beginning," I said. "Wait until she finds out who actually owns her house." "What do you mean?" I smiled. "Let's just say Bethany is about to discover that being a bully has consequences, especially when you're bullying your own landlord." As I walked back to my house, I could feel the shift in the neighborhood's energy. The spell was breaking. People were starting to question things they had accepted for years. And Bethany Cromwell, who'd ruled through fear for over a decade, was about to face something she'd never encountered before: accountability. That evening, I sat on my deck reviewing the paperwork that would fundamentally reshape waterfront estates. Each property deed, each transfer document, each carefully negotiated purchase agreement represented months of planning. The rental properties had been the easiest to acquire, their absentee owners happy to cash out at above-market rates. The vacation homes took more finesse, tracking down heirs and distant relatives who'd inherited properties they never visited. But the masterpiece, the coup de grace, was the Cromwell Family Trust. Harold Sr. had been a shrewd businessman, but his 3 other children were not. When he died, they had inherited equal shares in multiple properties, including Bethy's house. They despised their sister-in-law and were hemorrhaging money trying to maintain properties they didn't want. When my attorney approached them with a generous offer to buy out their controlling interest in the trust, they jumped at it faster than Bethany calling 911 on a new neighbor. The next morning arrived with all the subtlety of Bethy's personality. At 6 a.m. sharp, she was at my door with what appeared to be a process server, though the guy looked more like someone she'd hired from Craigslist to look official. "Mr. Reeves," she announced with triumph dripping from every word, "you're being served with a cease and desist order from the Waterfront Estates Homeowners Association. You have 24 hours to pay all outstanding fines or face immediate legal action." I took the papers, which were about as legally binding as a grocery list, and smiled. "Bethany, perfect timing. I have something for you. 2. I handed her an envelope that had been sitting on my entry table for exactly this moment. She tore it open with the eagerness of someone expecting victory, but her expression changed as she read the contents. "This is notice that Seabreeze Holdings, LLC, the new trustee of the Cromwell Family Trust, will be conducting a full inspection of the property at 1473 Waterfront Boulevard tomorrow at 9 Wainwright Gray. Please ensure the property is accessible and all maintenance records are available for review." Her face went through several expressions before landing on confusion. "This is ridiculous. You can't inspect my house. And what is Seabreeze Holdings?" "Seabreeze Holdings is the company that now controls the trust that owns your house. Bethany, you might want to check with your husband about those papers he signed last week. Something about restructuring the trust for tax purposes. The process server," clearly sensing this was above his pay grade, had already started backing toward his car. Bethany stood frozen on my porch, the papers trembling in her hands. "This is impossible. Harold handles all the trust paperwork. He would never—" "Never what? Never sign something without reading it carefully? Never trust his father's other children who've been trying to get out from under the trust for years? You might want to have that conversation with him sooner rather than later." She spun on her designer heels and practically ran back to her house. Already pulling out her phone, I could imagine the conversation she was about to have with poor Harold, who'd been so eager to sign whatever his siblings put in front of him just to keep the peace. Within an hour, the neighborhood grapevine was in full swing. Pete Morrison showed up with coffee and a barely contained grin. The whole street is buzzing. Bethy's been on the phone screaming at lawyers all morning. Harold left in his car about 20 minutes ago, looking like he'd seen a ghost. What did you do? I bought some property, I said simply. Quite a bit of property, actually. Pete's eyes widened. How much property? Let's see. The 7 rental houses on the south side of the street. The 3 vacation homes on the north side, the 2 estates that were in probate, the old Morrison place, no relation to you. That's been empty for 2 years. And as of yesterday, controlling interest in the trust that owns Bethy's house, Pete nearly dropped his coffee. You own 13 houses on this street. 14 if you count Bethy's. Though technically I just control the trust that owns it, she's still a beneficiary, so she can keep living there as long as she pays rent. Rent? Pete was practically choking on his laughter. Bethany has to pay you rent? Well, she has to pay the trust, which I control. Fair market value for a house that size on the lake is about $8,000 a month, though I might consider a discount if she's a good tenant. No loud parties, no harassment of other residents, following all the rules in her lease agreement. Pete was laughing so hard he had to sit down. This is the most beautiful thing I've ever witnessed. She's been terrorizing everyone for years, and now she's your tenant. Not just mine. Every rental property on this street is now under the same management company. Same rules, same expectations. No more arbitrary fines, no more made-up violations, just normal landlord-tenant relationships governed by actual law. As if on cue, my phone rang. It was David Sterling, my attorney. Jackson, I've got Bethany Cromwell's lawyer on the other line threatening to sue for fraud, conspiracy, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and about 15 other things that don't actually apply. You want me to handle it? Absolutely. And David, make sure he understands that any harassment of other tenants will result in immediate eviction proceedings. That includes all the homeowners she's been bullying. With pleasure. Oh, and the forensic accountant you hired just sent preliminary findings on the HOA finances. You're going to want to see this. After I hung up, I noticed a crowd forming in the street. Not at Bethy's house, but in front of mine. Maybe 20 neighbors had gathered, and more were coming. Janet Holmes seemed to be the unofficial spokesperson. Mr. Reeves, is it true? Do you really own half the neighborhood? 14 properties? I confirmed. All purchased legally over the last 6 months. But why? Richard asked. Why buy all these houses? I looked at the assembled crowd. These people who'd been living in fear of a petty tyrant for years. Honestly, I didn't start with a master plan. I was just looking for a quiet place to retire after my wife died. But when I researched the neighborhood, I kept hearing stories about the HOA president, who made everyone's life miserable. Then I discovered she was collecting fees from properties that weren't even part of the association, bullying people into selling below market value, and using her position for personal gain. So, you decided to buy the whole neighborhood? Someone asked incredulously. Not the whole neighborhood, just enough to make a point. Look, I've been successful in business, and I've learned that sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to take away their power. Bethy's power came from her position and her belief that she was untouchable. Well, she's about to learn otherwise. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman with the rolling pin, pushed through the crowd. Young man, are you saying Bethany Cromwell has to pay you rent now, starting next month? Yes, though she's welcome to buy the house from the trust if she can come up with the $8.7 million it's worth. The collective gasp from the crowd was deeply satisfying. Someone in the back actually started clapping, and soon others joined in. It was surreal, standing there being applauded for what was essentially an elaborate real estate revenge plot. That afternoon, Bethany made one last desperate play. She called an official HOA board meeting at the community center, sending out notices that attendance was mandatory and anyone who didn't show would be fined $500. The desperation was palpable. The community center was packed. Every homeowner had shown up, probably out of morbid curiosity more than fear of fines. Bethany stood at the podium looking haggard. Her usually perfect hair was slightly disheveled, her makeup smudged, and her designer outfit wrinkled like she'd slept in it. "We are facing an existential threat to our community," she began, her voice lacking its usual commanding tone. "This man, this outsider, has conspired to take over our neighborhood through fraudulent means. He's trying to destroy everything we've built here." Harold, who'd been sitting in the front row looking miserable, suddenly stood up. "Bethany, stop." The room went silent. In 11 years, nobody had ever seen Harold contradict his wife publicly. "It's over," he continued, his voice tired but firm. "There was no fraud. My siblings and I legally restructured the trust. I signed the papers myself. We've been bleeding money for years because of your vendettas and lawsuits. The HOA is $300,000 in debt because you've been using funds for personal legal battles." Bethy's face went white. "Harold, what are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm done. We're done, Mr. Reeves offered us a way out, and I took it. We can stay in the house as tenants, or we can move. But your reign of terror is over." The room erupted. People were shouting questions, demanding to see financial records, calling for Bethy's immediate resignation. Through it all, she stood at the podium looking like her world was ending, which I suppose it was. I stood up and walked to the front of the room. The crowd quieted, everyone wanting to hear what I had to say. "Here's what's going to happen," I said calmly. "First, Bethany is resigning as HOA president, effective immediately. Second, we're going to have a full forensic audit of the HOA finances for the past 11 years. Third, any illegally collected fees will be returned to the property owners. Fourth, we're going to vote on whether to dissolve the HOA entirely or restructure it with actual oversight and accountability." "You can't do this," Bethany shrieked. "You can't just come in here and destroy everything." "I'm not destroying anything. I'm stopping you from destroying a community. You've terrorized these people for over a decade. You've stolen money, issued illegal fines, and made everyone's life miserable for your own ego. It ends today." Patricia Lansing, one of Bethy's board allies, tried to speak up. "This is illegal. You can't force." "Actually," David Sterling said, entering the room with perfect timing, "everything Mr. Reeves has done is completely legal. I have the paperwork here if anyone wants to review it. I also have the preliminary forensic accounting report on the HOA finances. Would anyone like to know where their fees have been going?" Every hand in the room went up. David pulled out his laptop and connected it to the projector. The numbers that appeared on screen caused another collective gasp. Over the past 11 years, nearly $2 million had been collected in fees and fines. Of that, less than $200,000 had gone to actual neighborhood maintenance. The rest had been spent on legal fees for Bethy's personal vendettas, consulting fees to companies owned by her friends, and nearly $500,000 in administrative costs that seemed to have gone directly into Bethy's personal accounts. "This is embezzlement!" someone shouted. "She's been stealing from us for years." Bethany tried to run for the door, but Officer Hutchinson was already there. Apparently, someone had called the police when the financial crimes were revealed. "Mrs. Cromwell," he said with what sounded like satisfaction, "I'm going to need you to come with me for questioning regarding potential embezzlement and fraud charges." As she was led away, still protesting her innocence and threatening lawsuits, the room fell silent. Then, Mrs. Patterson started laughing. It was infectious, and soon the entire room was laughing. The kind of cathartic release that comes from watching a tyrant fall. The next 3 weeks were a whirlwind of activity. The HOA was officially dissolved by unanimous vote. The forensic audit revealed even more financial crimes, leading to formal charges against Bethany for embezzlement, fraud, and tax evasion. She was released on bail, but under strict orders not to contact any of the victims, which was basically the entire neighborhood. I hired a property management company to handle the rentals with Pete Morrison, as the local liaison since he knew everyone and was universally liked. The vacation homes were offered to their previous owners at fair market prices if they wanted to buy them back, and several took me up on it. The trust situation with Bethy's house was more complicated, but eventually Harold and his siblings agreed to sell it to a lovely family from Chicago who'd been looking for a lake house. Bethany and Harold ended up moving to a small condo in Florida, where presumably she had no HOA to take over. The last I heard, she was working as a receptionist at her brother-in-law's law firm. The judge having been removed from the bench for his part in enabling her crimes. As for me, I kept the Garrison house and 3 of the rental properties as investments. The rest I sold to either current tenants or new families looking to join a neighborhood that had learned its lesson about unchecked power. 6 months later, we held the first annual Waterfront Estates Freedom Festival, celebrating the anniversary of Bethy's arrest. The party was held on the private beach that we'd restored using some of the recovered embezzled funds. Everyone contributed food, drinks, and stories about their worst Bethany encounters. Pete Morrison gave a toast that perfectly captured the mood to Jackson Reeves, who proved that sometimes the best revenge isn't just living well. It's buying your enemy's house and charging them rent. The crowd erupted in cheers and laughter. I raised my beer, looking out at the lake where the setting sun painted the water gold. Sarah would have loved this, I thought. She always said the best communities were the ones that stood up for each other. Mrs. Patterson came over and patted my arm. "You did a good thing here, young man, though I have to ask, did you plan this from the beginning?" I smiled. Honestly, I just wanted a quiet place to retire. But when I saw what was happening here, I couldn't just stand by. I had the resources to do something, so I did. Well, you've given us our neighborhood back. That's worth more than all the property values in the world. As the party continued into the evening, I noticed a for sale sign going up on the last house I didn't own on the street. The owner, walking by with his dog, stopped to chat. "You interested in completing your collection?" he asked with a grin. "Absolutely not," I laughed. "I'm retired, remember? Besides, I think this neighborhood has had enough excitement for a while." He nodded and continued his walk, and I settled back into my chair, watching my neighbors, my tenants, my friends. Enjoying their freedom, Bethany Cromwell had called 911 to report me for trespassing. She'd ended up in handcuffs while I ended up owning her house. Sometimes karma doesn't just come around. It buys real estate and serves eviction notices. The lake was calm that evening, the water reflecting the lights from the houses along Waterfront Boulevard. Every house was different, every family unique. But for the first time in over a decade, they were united in something other than fear. They were free. And that freedom had come from the most unlikely source: a grieving widower with too much money and a low tolerance for bullies.